remote desktop, and remote assistance. Remote desktop and remote assistance have been around since Windows XP, and in all honesty, not much has changed with Windows Vista. For those of you that haven't used or don't know what remote desktop is, it's a way that you can access a remote computer and view and use the computer as if you were sitting right in front of it, logged on locally at the keyboard. In client operating systems like Windows Vista, remote desktop can only accept a maximum of one incoming connection over the TCP port 3389. Now this means that you can only have a single logged on user, and that includes the locally logged on user. So if you're logged on locally to Windows Vista and someone wants to connect to Vista using remote desktop, your connection will have to be stopped for the remote user to connect. Now this default port of 3389 can be changed to another port if you like, although it does involve a registry change. So we'll click on Start and we'll type in regedit and we'll hit Enter, and then we'll need to click Continue here on our user account control message. Now we'll expand HKey local machine, System, Current Control Set, then Control, and we'll scroll down until we can locate Terminal Server, and then WinStations. I'm just going to expand this because it's getting a little bit hard to see what's going on here. And we'll choose RDP TCP, and on the right hand side we'll scroll down and then we'll choose port number. Now if we double click on port number and change this to decimal, then we can enter in an alternate port number of our own choice. Now just be aware that since this is the registry, any change that you make here will be permanent. Now there are two parts to a remote desktop connection, and they're typically referred to as the client and the server. Although don't just assume because I'm saying a server that I'm referring to a server operating system like Windows Server 2000 or Windows Server 2003. Not at all. Both machines involved in the remote desktop can be client operating systems, so we could perform a Vista to Vista remote desktop, or Windows 2000 to Windows Vista, and so on. So when I say the two components are a client and server, the client is where you start the remote desktop connection, the server is the end that accepts the connection and displays the desktop. So let's go and take a look at the server side of the connection first. This is where we'll be configuring Windows Vista so that we can accept remote desktop connections. Now even though remote desktop is installed by default on Windows Vista, it must be explicitly allowed before any connections can be made. So to enable the remote desktop feature, we'll click on Start and we'll right click on Computer and we'll choose Properties. Now on the left hand side we'll choose Advanced System Settings, and then we'll click Continue on our user account control message, and then we'll go to the Remote tab, and here we have two areas to configure. Now the first checkbox here is to enable remote assistance, and we'll talk about that later in this video, but for now just be aware that by default this box here is already checked, so there's nothing we need to do at all to be able to ask another user for remote assistance, but again we'll talk about remote assistance later in this video. Now the second option down here is where we can configure Windows Vista to allow or deny users to connect remotely to this computer. Now by default, this top option here is checked not to allow any remote connections to this computer. The only reason that the second button on my machine is already selected is that I'm currently connecting to this Windows Vista machine using remote desktop. So to enable remote desktop, we need to select one of these two buttons. So we can allow connections from computers running any version of remote desktop, which means that any version of Windows that supports a remote desktop connection will be able to connect to us, such as Windows 2000, XP, and so forth. Or we can choose to only allow computers to connect to us that are running remote desktop with network level authentication. Basically, this means that in order to connect, the client machine will need to be running version 6 or higher of the RDP client. And that means, at a minimum, you're going to need Windows Vista. or you'll need to download the RDP client update from Microsoft's website, which will enable Windows XP and Windows Server 2003 machines to connect. So if you choose this option, then you won't be able to connect to this machine using Remote Desktop if your client is a Windows XP machine, for example, unless you've applied that update. Anything earlier than Windows XP, though, will not be able to connect at all. Now, the truth is that if you're connecting to a Windows Vista machine from another Windows Vista machine using Remote Desktop, then you will be using network level authentication anyway, and this setting here really has no effect. But like I said a moment ago, if you select this option and you're trying to connect from a Windows 2000 or older machine, or Windows XP or 2003 without the client update installed, then you won't be able to use Remote Desktop. So which one should you use? Well, that really depends on whether or not you need to connect to Vista from legacy operating systems. If you do, choose the middle option. But if it's only Vista to Vista, or you've patched the client machines, then choose the third option, which is more secure. Now, if you do need to go and download the client patch, by the way, we can simply point our browser to this URL here, and this is where you can find the updated RDP client. Now, by the way, in case you were wondering, behind the scenes, when you configure Vista to allow Remote Desktop access, it will also enable the Remote Desktop rules in the Windows firewall to allow incoming RDP communication. And that's great, so you don't have to manually go and do it yourself. But if you're at all interested in which rules are enabled, we'll go and click on Start, and I'm just going to type in Fire, and we'll launch the Windows firewall, and we'll click Continue. Alright, in the top left, we'll choose Inbound Rules, and we'll scroll down in our list here, and we'll locate the Remote Desktop rule. Here it is. So we'll right click on it and we'll choose Properties. Okay, and here we can see that this Remote Desktop rule is enabled for TCP communication over port 3389. And since we've configured Remote Desktop, the action is to allow the connection. However, on the Users and Computers tab and our Scope tabs, we can further lock down who can access our computer by Remote Desktop by defining which users and computers and which IP addresses are allowed to connect. So if you're at all interested in tighter security, you can come in here and then make those required changes. Okay, now down here on the right of our Remote tab, we have a Select Users button. Now if we click this, we can then add in users that we want to grant access to connect to our computer using Remote Desktop. Now by default, administrators already have access, and we can see here that the trainer account, which is an administrator account, already does have access. So to add a new user, we'll simply click on the Add button and then type in the name of the account that we wish to add. So let's add in a user on this computer, and I've got a user here called Bob. So we'll type in Bob, we'll click the Check Names button. There's Bob's account, so we'll click on OK. Now conversely, if you wish to remove people from accessing your computer using Remote Desktop, we can simply highlight their name and then click Remove. Now, by adding in users here, all it really does is add them to a group on our computer called the Remote Desktop Users group. So I'm going to click on OK here, and we'll right click on Computer and choose Manage, and we'll click Continue. Now we'll expand Local Users and Groups, and we'll select Groups, and then we'll right click on Remote Desktop Users Group and we'll choose Properties. And in here we can see that Bob is a member of this group. And of course we can add in users directly in here as well. So if we go and click on the Add button, let's add in Jane this time. So we'll type a name in, click Check Names, and then OK. And there we can see we now have Bob and Jane in our Remote Desktop Users group. So if we click on OK here, and I'll just minimize our computer management console. And now if we go back to our Select Users button, we can now see that Jane has been added. So take your pick, you can add or remove users from here, or from the computer management console, it doesn't make any difference. They both do the same thing. So right now, as it stands, Bob, Jane, and any administrators on this computer now have access using Remote Desktop simply by logging on and providing their standard username and password. Okay, well, what we've just configured here is the server side of a Remote Desktop connection for when other people want to connect to this Windows Vista computer. So now let's go and take a look at the client side of Remote Desktop. So to connect to another computer using Remote Desktop, we'll first need to start the Remote Desktop connection utility. So we'll go and click on Start, we'll choose All Programs, Accessories, and here we have the Remote Desktop connection. And to connect to another computer at this point, all you need to do is simply type in the IP address or hostname of the computer and click Connect. It's really easy. So let's try it. I've got another Windows Vista machine on my network here, so I'm going to type in the IP address of 10.0.0.66. And if you have changed the listening port from 3389 to something else, then you'll need to enter in a colon and the port number, and that's it. Okay, well, we haven't changed our port number here, so we've still got it at the default. So we'll just simply click Connect. And now we're presented with this login box like you see here, and this login box is using network level authentication. Now remember that even though I chose the second option to allow older RDP clients to connect, I'm connecting Vista to Vista, so network level authentication will be applied anyway. Okay, well, we'll need to enter in the details of a user that has permission to access the remote machine. Of course, this account must either be an administrator's account or have their account added to the Remote Desktop Users group on the target machine. Okay, so I'm going to use my trainer account here, and I'll enter in my password. And if we like, we can choose to remember my details for future connections, which will save my username and password, and that'll make future connections quicker, since I don't have to enter in the password again, but it also makes it less secure, since anyone that's able to log onto my computer will then be able to use Remote Desktop to connect to this machine without a password. Alright, so we'll click on OK, and our connection will start, and it's logged us onto our remote machine, just as if we were sitting directly in front of it. Alright, well, let's just log off this connection for now, and we can do that by clicking on Start, and then this arrow icon here, and then choosing Log Off. But let's say that we've been using this connection for a while, and we've got a bunch of applications open. Say, for example, we've been writing in Notepad, and let's just go and open up Notepad, and we'll just write some data in this Notepad here for a moment. So I've got this Notepad open with the word test in it. Now, if we want to stop using Remote Desktop, but we don't want our applications to be closed, then we can choose to disconnect the session rather than logging off. And we can do that by clicking the little X in the title bar here at the top, or we can click on Start and then choose this X button here, and that'll also disconnect our session. Okay, so our session's been disconnected, so let's go and reconnect to it again. So again, we'll click on Start. In fact, there's our Remote Desktop connection there, but All Programs, Accessories, and choose Remote Desktop Connection. And it's remembered our last connection, so the host name or IP address is already there, so I'm just going to click Connect. Now we'll need to enter in our password and click on OK. Alright, and as you can see, any applications that we did have open when we disconnected our previous session are still there. However, if we log off, our applications will be closed, just as if you'd logged off your computer normally. So to log off and completely close all applications, we'll click Start, then we'll choose our arrow icon here, and then we'll choose Log Off. Alright, well, let's go and launch the Remote Desktop client again, and this time we'll take a closer look at the client configuration side. Okay, so I'm just going to move this up, and we'll click the Options button, And let's take a look at what we've got available. Now on the first tab here, the General tab, we can see the connection information. The last server that we connected to is listed, along with the last username that we used to connect if we save that information. Now down the bottom of this window, we can also save a remote connection or open any saved connection. Now this save option doesn't save the actual remote desktop or any part of it. What it does is enable you to pre-configure all of this information from all of these tabs here and then save this configuration into an RDP file. RDP is just the extension for a remote desktop connection file. Then all you're going to have to do is double click on the file, and then it's going to ask you to connect to whatever computer you specified using your custom settings rather than having to configure these options each time you want to connect. And that's useful if you like to connect to different servers using different settings. Now on the Display tab, we have the options of setting what size we would like the remote desktop to display in, and the default here is to display it in full screen. So to change the size of the remote desktop window, we'll just drag the slider bar to the left, and that'll make the remote desktop window smaller, and all the way to the right, of course, is full screen. Now we can also choose what color depth we want the remote desktop to appear in. The default here is 32-bit color, but we can select fewer colors if we like, such as say 16-bit or 256 colors. Now the biggest drawback to using these greater color depths, like the default of 32-bit, is that more information will need to be sent back from the server to your client computer, and obviously the more data that needs to be transferred, the slower the remote desktop connection will be. So as a general rule, if you're connecting to a real server to do some remote administration, then you probably won't really need 32-bit color, so the lowest setting of 256 colors generally will be more than enough in most cases. Now finally, we've got an option here if we'd like to see the connection bar when we're in full screen mode, and we saw that at the top of our remote desktop session a moment ago. Now on the Local Resources tab, we've got the option of playing any sounds that you'd normally hear on the remote server on our computer, which is useful if your application gives you audio feedback, but generally speaking, I normally choose not to play them at all, or you can leave those sounds at the remote computer. Now we can also opt to use Alt-Tab in full screen mode or restrict Alt-Tab presses to only the local computer or the remote computer. And of course, Alt-Tab is used to switch between applications currently running on your computer, and by default, it only works in full screen mode. Now we also have options of allowing our local printers and local clipboard to be used within the remote desktop session. What this means, for example, is that if you have, say, this clipboard here checked, and when you're logged on to the remote server using remote desktop, you can then cut and paste between your local system and the remote desktop system. With printers, you're able to print from the remote desktop to printers that are attached to your local computer. Even if the remote desktop computer doesn't have a printer attached, it can use yours. Now if we click on the More button, we can also allow the remote desktop computer to use our smart cards, serial ports, and hard drives as well. And that's great, so you can copy data back and forth between your local computer and the remote one. And also any supported plug-and-play devices. And if we go and expand this here, it also allows you to add support for devices you might plug in later, such as a USB memory stick, for example, and then of course you can access that via the remote machine. Now on the Programs tab, we can choose if we want to run a program when we start the remote desktop connection. But bear in mind though, that this only works when we're connecting to a terminal server, so it'll have no effect if you type something in here and you're connecting to another Windows Vista machine, for example. So here, if you're connecting to a terminal server, then this program that you enter in this window will start on the remote desktop machine, by the way, not your local computer. So you will need to make sure that the terminal server does in fact have the application on it for it to be able to start. So simply check this box and then type in the name of the program if you need to run an application on startup, and that's it. Now, an important thing to understand with this setting is that if you do decide to run a program on the terminal server at startup, then that's all the user can do in that remote session. So let's say, for example, I was to type in C:\Windows/ we'll use Notepad as our example here. Alright, so we've just entered in the path to Windows Notepad. So let's just click Connect. And we'll enter in our password and we'll click on OK. Alright, now notice here that I've just got a message that's asking, am I sure I want to allow access to our local disk drives and clipboard, because I did select that local disk drive option or my hard drive option before. So I'm just going to say yes and not to prompt me for that again. So we'll say yes. Alright, and you can see here that our remote desktop session is loading. Now, if I was connecting to a real terminal server, you'd see Notepad that would be launched automatically here. Then once the user closes Notepad, then this remote desktop session would be automatically terminated. So if we use this feature, just be aware that that's all you can do. Of course, in my situation here, since I'm connecting to another Windows Vista machine and not a terminal server, as you can see, entering stuff on that Programs tab does absolutely nothing. Okay, so the general rule of thumb here is that if the user does need to run multiple applications or remain logged on to the remote computer to do other things, then don't enter the name of any applications on this tab. Okay, well the next tab we've got here is the Experience tab, and here is where you can specify options that basically make your remote desktop look better or make your connection work faster. Now in this drop-down box here, you can choose a predefined connection type. Now this just simply adjusts these checkboxes down here to either switch on or switch off options to maximize your connection's performance. So if you're connecting using a 28.8 modem, the only thing that's going to occur is the bitmap caching. And that'll make the connection a little quicker. However, if you are running, say, a 10 megabit LAN or higher, then you'd have enough bandwidth for some of these other features, like showing the desktop background on the remote system and Windows animations and so forth. Now again, all of these things here do take up valuable bandwidth and slow things down, so if you want a lean, fast desktop, especially if you're connecting over the internet or a slow WAN link, then uncheck most of these boxes here and just leave bitmap caching, and that'll be the fastest connection possible. Now down the bottom here, the default is to also try and automatically reconnect to the remote desktop session if the connection is dropped, and I've often had connections drop out when using, say, wireless networks in the past, and this is great because it saves you from having to manually try and connect again. So personally, I'd leave this box checked, but that's up to you. Okay, well the final tab we have here is a new one, the Advanced tab. In the top part of this tab here, it's concerned with server authentication, which deals with authenticating with the machine that you're trying to establish a remote desktop session to. Now this authentication is designed to make sure that the computer name that you type into this remote desktop connection utility is the actual one that you're really connecting to, and you're not being redirected to some other computer that's masquerading as the one that you really want to connect to. Now the default here is to warn you if authentication fails, but you'll still be able to connect. Now we can change this so that we always connect even if authentication fails, or we could simply refuse to connect, which is the most secure option. But be aware that computers that are running operating systems earlier than Windows Server 2003 with Service Pack 1 will not be able to prove their identity. So if you choose this third option to not connect if authentication fails, and you're trying to connect, say, a Windows 2000 server that doesn't have any service packs applied, then the connection will fail, even though it may be the real machine that you intended to connect to. So if that's the case, and you still need to use remote desktop to connect to older machines, I'd leave the default at warn, and that way you can still connect. Now down the bottom here in our Advanced tab, we can configure a terminal services gateway to allow us to connect to other remote computers that are protected by a firewall. Now, in order for this to work, you will of course need to have a Terminal Services Gateway installed. Now, the reason that a Terminal Services Gateway is useful is that typically the remote desktop port of 3389 is blocked at most firewalls to prevent outsiders from getting in. With a Terminal Services Gateway, you can first establish a connection over the standard secure web port of 443, and then it will handle the connection to and from the remote desktop target machine. So outside the network, you'll talk on port 443. Internally, normal communication occurs on port 3389, and this allows you to get through the firewall. So the default here is to automatically try and detect the Terminal Services Gateway settings, although you can specify your own settings here if you'd prefer, or if you're having problems with automatically detecting the correct settings. And of course, you can choose not to use a Terminal Service Gateway server at all. Now, once you've set all of these configuration options to what you want them to be, if this is going to be a connection that you're going to use regularly, such as to a server that you manage on a daily basis, personally I'd go back to the General tab and then choose Save As, and I'll just go and navigate to my desktop, and we'll save this connection. I'm just going to call this one Vista, and we'll click Save. Now all we need to do is simply double click on this icon, and that'll launch our remote desktop session. So all we have to do now is simply enter in our password and click OK. And of course that's much easier. Okay, well, the next thing that we should discuss in this video is remote assistance. Introduced back in Windows XP, and of course also included in Windows Server 2003, is remote assistance. Now, building on what we've seen with remote desktop, remote assistance enables the user on a computer to request help from another person and then have that person remotely connect to your computer to view or assist you in performing a task. Now, on a client operating system like Windows Vista, this is quite a useful feature, where someone such as a help desk person or a friendly brother, for example, could view a user's desktop to see where they're going wrong with performing a task, and then either tell them how to perform the task correctly or take over their desktop and perform the task for them while they watch. In fact, I actually do this with my brother, who's quite uneducated when it comes to computers, so rather than spending hours on the phone trying to talk him through finding where the start button is, which I have done by the way, he can use the remote assistance feature to ask me for help. Then I can accept his request and fix the problem for him while he looks on at his end watching what I'm doing. Now, we've already seen earlier in this video that the remote assistance feature is turned on by default, so there's nothing you need to do to configure it, so let's get started. So we'll click on Start, we'll choose All Programs, then we'll choose Maintenance, and then Windows Remote Assistance. Okay, well, we've got two options here. We could invite somebody to help us, or we can offer to help somebody else. So let's invite somebody to help us. So we'll click the top option here, and then we can either create an email to send to the person that we want to help us with our request, or we could save our invitation to a file and transfer it to them by some other means, such as transferring it to them by using MSN Messenger or putting it on a network share or some other way. Alright, well, I'm going to choose to save this invitation to a file, and you can see here that it's defaulting to my desktop, and I'm happy with that, although we could click Browse and then save it wherever we like. Now, we will need to enter in a password for this file, so I'm going to type the password in now, and we'll do it again just to confirm it. And it's important that you do remember this password, because the person that you're going to ask for help will also need to enter in this password for them to be able to connect to your computer. So if you're at all concerned about the security implications of this, just be sure that when you tell the password to the person that you want to connect to your machine, that you don't send it in the same email as the invitation or in a text file with the invitation. You could probably ring them and tell them, or send these two items in different ways. For example, you could use MSN Messenger to send them the file and send them the password in an email or tell them over the phone. Now either way, how you do that's your choice. So I'm going to click Finish, and we can see here that our computer is now waiting for an incoming connection. Now whilst it's waiting for me to get on the remote machine and connect, let me show you something else about remote desktop. If you've enabled clipboard sharing, you can also cut and paste not only text, but files as well between your host machine and the remote desktop machine. Now since I've got a remote desktop session here already open with another machine, I'm going to cheat and I'm going to simply right click on our invitation file here, and I'm going to choose Copy. And now we'll go to our remote desktop session, and on the desktop there we're going to right click and choose Paste, and here you can see there's our file copied. Alright, now what I'm going to do for the moment is I'm going to disconnect this remote desktop session again, and I'm going to reopen it since it's running in this rather low resolution in this screen here, and it's going to be a little difficult for us to see what's going on this machine that's connecting to us. Alright, so I've just now logged on using remote desktop to our remote machine. So here we can see we do have our invitation file. So we'll double click on this file, and we'll need to enter in the password. So we'll do that now and click on OK. Alright, now as you can see here, this opens up Windows Remote Assistance, and we're currently waiting for acceptance from the local computer. Okay, now I've just switched back to our local computer, and you can see that we've just got this message asking us to confirm that we will allow the remote machine to connect to us, so we'll say yes. Alright, now we're connected, but at this point, all our remote user can do is view the desktop. The remote user can't change anything until we've given them permission to do so. But do keep in mind that our remote user can now watch what we're doing on our screen, as they'll now have a session showing our exact desktop and what we're doing on it. So if I just move my remote desktop session here so we can see the other session behind it, you'll note here that when I move the mouse around in my local machine, you can see that the remote machine is seeing exactly what I'm doing, giving that person who's helping me a look at what I'm doing on my desktop. Okay, so from our computer here, we can choose to disconnect the session if we no longer need it. We can stop sharing if we've allowed the remote user to interact with our desktop, and we'll see that in a moment when I switch over to the remote user's desktop. We can pause our session, and this is going to suspend any interaction, but it'll still keep our session alive. Now if we click on the Settings button, we can see here that the default is to hit the Escape key on our keyboard to stop sharing the control of our machine, and to automatically save a log of this remote assistance session. Now we can also choose whether we want to optimize bandwidth, which is useful for slow connection. So if we move this slider bar down, it's going to use less bandwidth, and it's going to do this by using lower colors and no backgrounds and so on. But if we slide it all the way to the top, it's not going to optimize our connection at all. So depending on how your remote session is performing, you can come in here and then adjust these settings accordingly. Okay, well, the next option that we have here is chat, and this is a nifty little feature that allows you to engage in an MSN Messenger style chat with the remote helper. And this is especially useful if the person who's helping you is interstate or overseas, and a long phone call would be expensive. So here you can chat within the session itself. So if we click this, we can immediately start chatting. So as the person requesting help, I could simply type in something like, "I need help," and I hit enter, and you can see here that over on our remote machine, that this text immediately appears on their screen just like it would in MSN Messenger. So on the remote machine here, the person helping us can now respond with something like, "What do you need?" Alright, well, let's assume that I'm having a problem, so on my local machine, I'm going to ask that person for help. Alright, so I've just asked this person, I can't find the advanced firewall on Vista, can you help? So the remote person then can engage in this exchange of dialogue with me, and we can see here that the remote person has decided that the best way to help me is to do it for me rather than explain it. So what they can do on their computer is now choose to request control of my desktop. So if we click this, and we'll go back to our local machine here, we can now choose to allow the remote person to take control of our system. Now, if you're at all worried about them taking over and you not having any control, relax, because if at any stage you don't like what they're doing, you can terminate the connection immediately. Now here, if the remote user needs to run applications or settings that's going to display a user account control prompt, we can also allow them to click on those as well. So we'll select this and we'll choose the yes button. And we'll need to also click on the user account control message ourselves. Okay, now we can see that our helper, the remote user, is now connected to our machine. We could also see that this stop sharing button is now available, and if we click this button or hit the escape key, then the remote control portion of the connection will be terminated. So that way, the actual remote connection is still live, you can still chat, the remote user can still watch your desktop, but they have no control once you hit escape or click this button. Alright, now that the remote user has control, they can then access your desktop just as easily as they can access their own local desktop. Okay, so to solve this user's problem, we can see that they've asked for help to find the advanced firewall on Vista. So what we'll do is we'll just scroll down and we'll click on Start. We'll simply type in ADV. And if we just scroll up again here, we can then launch the Windows firewall with advanced security for them. Okay, now notice here that we do get a user account control message on the remote PC, so we'll click Continue. And now we've loaded the firewall console and we've solved the remote user's problem. Alright, now the final thing that we can do up here is we could also transfer files between these two sessions. So if we just click on Send File, we simply need to browse to the location of the file that we want to send. So I'm just going to send this invitation back and we'll click Open. And we'll go back to our local machine here. And of course you can see we've got a prompt whether to accept this file. So we'll just say yes. And we can choose where to save it. So I'm just going to overwrite the old one on my desktop here. And it's a great feature that, especially if the help you're getting does require you to update some software or run a hotfix or something like that, you can simply transfer that file across. Okay, we're done here. Our problem's been fixed by our remote user. So to stop our remote user having control of our computer, we could simply click on the Stop Sharing button or hit Escape on our keyboard. We can see our remote user is still connected to us, but they can only now see our desktop and they can't take control of it. And over on the remote machine, you can see it's now changed to just simply viewing the machine. Okay, so if we no longer need the connection at all, we can now choose to disconnect the session and then part ways until the next time one of us needs help. In this video, we've looked at the way in which we can use remote desktop to connect to and manage our remote computers. We've looked at the options that you have when configuring a remote desktop session, including sharing your disks, clipboard, and other peripherals. And we also looked at how we can use the remote assistance feature to request help from another person, with them being able to watch our desktop in a kind of advisory role or take control and do things on our computer for us while we watch them. Remote assistance really is a great method of providing support to a user, and remote desktop, well, let me just say that if you're a Windows administrator, you'll probably be using it every day as it's such a useful tool.